I've worked at a crematorium long enough to know what people imagine when they hear the word. They picture flames, shadows, something grim and dramatic. The truth is quieter than that. Most nights, the building feels less like a place of death and more like a machine that never quite sleeps. Fans hum behind the walls. Fluorescent lights buzz overhead. The air carries a faint metallic warmth that never fully goes away. My name is Ethan Ward. I'm 52 years old, and for the past 17 years, this has been my job. I come in, check the schedule, review the paperwork, and make sure everything runs exactly the way it's supposed to. Precision matters here. Temperatures, timing, documentation. There's comfort in routine, especially in a place like this. People ask me all the time if the work gets to me. If being around the dead changes how you see things. I usually tell them no. The dead are predictable. They don't argue. They don't rush you. They don't surprise you. Whatever chaos existed in their lives ends when they arrive here. That's always been the part one found easiest. The living are different. Most of my shifts are uneventful. I operate the equipment, log the hours, double-check the identification tags, and keep the records clean. When families are involved, there's a respectful distance we maintain. When there aren't any, when a body is unclaimed, the process is even simpler. No service. No witnesses. Just procedure. Unclaimed cases happen more often than people think. Someone passes without relatives, or with family who can't be found, or who don't want to be. The county sends them to us with a thin folder and a metal tag. A name if there is one. An estimate of age. Cause of death, sometimes vague. It's not my job to ask why no one came forward. My job is to make sure the end is handled correctly. There's a cabinet in the administrative office where those folders are kept. Plain metal drawers. Alphabetized when possible. Otherwise, marked unclaimed in black ink. The photos attached to those files are strictly for identification. Nothing more. Front-facing. Neutral expression. No editing, no retakes. Once the file is closed, it's never opened again. That's one of the rules Frank Miller, our supervisor, drills into everyone. Frank's been here longer than me. Former military. Square shoulders, clipped sentences. He believes rules exist because people fail without them. Don't personalize the work, he says. And don't revisit closed files. I've always followed that rule. On most nights, after midnight, the building settles into something close to silence. The hallways stretch long and empty. Stainless steel reflects light in dull, tired ways. If you listen closely, you can hear the building breathe, air moving through vents, heat expanding and contracting. It's not eerie. It's mechanical. Honest. That's when I usually review the next day's paperwork. Keeps my hands busy and my mind focused. I flip through files the way a librarian might, without lingering. Faces blur together after a while. Old men. Middle-aged women. People who look like they could have been anyone. The folder that would later trouble me didn't stand out at first. It wasn't thicker than the others. There were no handwritten notes, no warning labels. Just a standard form, a metal ID tag clipped to the corner, and a single photograph. At the time, I saw nothing unusual about it. I logged it, returned it to the drawer, and went back to my shift, believing, like I always had, that once the paperwork was done, nothing about that person could follow me out of the room. I was wrong. The folder stayed in the cabinet for 3 days before it came back across my desk. That wasn't unusual. Unclaimed cases moved slowly. Paperwork had to clear the county office. A waiting period had to pass. Sometimes someone showed up at the last minute, claiming a body no one else wanted. Most of the time no one did. When I pulled the file out again, it felt lighter than I remembered. Not in weight, just in presence. Thin. Incomplete. The kind of folder that carried the quiet suggestion that this person had already been forgotten. The front page read unclaimed, male. Estimated age, early 60s. No name listed. No emergency contact. The cause of death was typed in a careful, impersonal font, the way official documents always are when they don't want to commit to certainty. Natural causes. Found alone. I checked the metal tag clipped to the corner of the file and compared the number to the logbook. Everything matched. Procedure satisfied. The photograph was attached beneath the summary sheet. I paused just long enough to register it properly. The man's face was centered in the frame, shoulders squared, eyes open. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't frowning. His expression sat in that neutral space used for identification, designed to capture features without emotion. Gray hair cut short. Skin loose around the jaw. A faint crease between the eyebrows that suggested a habit of concentration. There was nothing remarkable about him. If I passed him on the street, I wouldn't have remembered him 5 minutes later. That was true of most unclaimed cases. I flipped through the rest of the paperwork. Intake time. Storage location. Chain of custody. The forms were clean, initialed where they needed to be. No handwritten notes in the margins. No flags. Whoever processed him did exactly what they were supposed to do. I closed the folder and slid it back into the drawer, already thinking about the rest of my shift. "Don't linger on those," Frank said later when he saw me logging the file again. He stood in the doorway of the office, arms crossed, posture straight even after a 12-hour day. Frank had a way of speaking that made every sentence sound like a reminder, even when it wasn't meant to be. "Unclaimed is unclaimed," he continued. "We keep the record straight, we follow the timeline, and we move on." "I know," I said. "Good," he replied. "And remember, those photos aren't souvenirs. No one needs to see them more than once." I nodded. It wasn't a rebuke. Just policy. The kind of rule you stop questioning after enough years. That night, the building felt heavier than usual. Not louder. Not colder. Just full. As if the air carried more than heat and dust. I told myself it was the weather, the humidity pressing in from outside. Old buildings always reacted to changes like that. I went back to my routine. Checked the furnace readouts. Logged maintenance notes. Walked the length of the main corridor and back again. Everything functioned the way it should. When I returned to the office near the end of my shift, I opened the cabinet to file another folder. The unclaimed drawer slid out with a soft metallic rasp. Rows of thin folders stared back at me, identical in shape and color. For a moment, I couldn't remember why I'd opened it. Then my eyes landed on the same file I'd handled earlier. The metal tag caught the light at a slightly different angle. The folder sat exactly where I'd placed it. Nothing disturbed. Nothing out of order. I told myself to close the drawer. Instead, I pulled the folder out again. The photograph was still there, clipped neatly to the page. The man's face looked the same at first glance. Same neutral expression. Same empty background. But something in his eyes held my attention longer than it should have. I leaned closer, feeling faintly ridiculous for doing so. The lighting in the office hadn't changed. The angle was the same. Yet the longer I looked, the more unsettled I became, not because I saw something new but because I couldn't shake the sense that he was no longer looking past the camera. I shut the folder harder than necessary and slid it back into the drawer. I didn't mention it to Frank. I didn't write anything in the log. I told myself it was fatigue, nothing more. Another face blending into another shift. Still, when I turned off the office light and walked down the empty hallway, I had the distinct feeling that something behind me remained unfinished, and that it knew exactly where I worked. I didn't open the drawer again for 2 days. That wasn't deliberate at first. My shifts were full, the kind that leave no room for idle thought. A maintenance issue on Furnace 2. A late delivery that pushed the schedule back. The ordinary distractions of work did their job well enough. When your hands are busy, your mind follows. Still, the image stayed with me. Not the man's face exactly, but the way I'd felt looking at it, like I'd arrived halfway through a moment I wasn't meant to witness. I told myself that memory has a way of rearranging things, especially when you're tired. After 17 years, faces overlapped. Details blurred. That was normal. On the third night, I had no reason to avoid the office. I needed to review the next day's files before my shift ended. The routine was comforting in its predictability. Papers, dates, signatures, all the small anchors that keep you steady. The unclaimed drawer slid open with the same familiar sound. I stood there for a second, longer than necessary, aware of my own hesitation. The building was quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you aware of your own breathing. I told myself this was nothing. That if I was going to work here, I couldn't afford to flinch at paperwork. I pulled the folder out. At first, everything looked exactly as it should have. Same clipped photo. Same forms. Same faint smudge on the bottom corner of the page where the copier had jammed. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Then I looked at the photograph more carefully. It wasn't a dramatic change. There was no sudden movement, no sharp shift that screamed something was wrong. In fact, if someone else had been standing there, they might not have noticed anything at all. But I did. The man's eyes no longer felt distant. They weren't sharper exactly, just more present. The unfocused, neutral stare I remembered had narrowed slightly, as though his attention had been drawn inward toward the lens. The crease between his brows seemed deeper, giving the impression of thought rather than emptiness. I tilted my head, then straightened it again. Changed my distance from the page. The expression held. My first reaction was annoyance. At myself mostly. I'd seen this before, the way the brain fills in gaps when it wants to make sense of something. Pareidolia they call it. Faces where there are none. Meaning where there isn't any. I checked the clip holding the photo in place. It was sealed, undisturbed. The paper hadn't been swapped. There were no fingerprints, no curling edges, nothing to suggest anyone had handled it since I had. I closed the folder and opened it again. The expression didn't change. A cold awareness settled in my chest. Not fear yet, but the beginning of it. Only then did I realize my hands were cold, even though the room wasn't. Not shaking, just distant, like they didn't quite belong to me anymore. The kind that asks a question you don't want to answer. I searched my memory, replaying the first time I'd seen the image. I tried to recall every detail. The lighting. The angle. The way his eyes had looked. I couldn't be sure anymore. That uncertainty bothered me more than any imagined difference. If I couldn't trust my own recollection, then I had nothing solid to stand on. Just impressions. Feelings. The worst kind of evidence. I did what I should have done immediately. I verified the logbook. The drawer had been opened once, by me, on the night I logged the file. No other entries. No access after hours. The camera in the hallway outside the office showed no movement near the cabinet during my absence. Frank hadn't been on shift. Helen worked days and hadn't touched the file since intake. No one had been near it. I returned to the photograph one last time, forcing myself to study it as clinically as possible. I described it in my head the way we're trained to. Mel. Gray hair. Neutral mouth. Eyes forward. And yet, the longer I looked, the harder it became to ignore the feeling that the neutrality was an act. That something behind the image had shifted from being observed to being aware. I shut the folder and placed it back in the drawer with deliberate care. That night, I wrote nothing in the log. There was no category for doubt. No box for impressions. The system wasn't built to record what I was experiencing, and I wasn't about to be the one to introduce it. As I locked the office and walked toward the exit, the lights dimmed automatically behind me, one section at a time. I told myself the unease would fade by morning. That memory would settle back into something reasonable. But as the door closed and the building went quiet again, I understood something I hadn't before. I wasn't afraid that the photograph had changed. I was afraid that it had been changing the entire time, and I was only just beginning to notice. By the next shift, I had decided on one thing. If I was going to keep working here, I needed proof that what I was seeing wasn't real. Not reassurance. Not comfort. Proof. I arrived early before the rest of the building fully woke up. The halls were dim, the air cool and metallic, the kind of quiet that presses against your ears. I went straight to the office and pulled the logbook from the shelf. Every access to the file cabinet was recorded, time, name, purpose. It was tedious, but that was the point. Systems like ours existed to remove doubt. The unclaimed file showed exactly what I already knew. One access. One. No late-night entries. No unexplained gaps. I checked the security footage next. The camera outside the office door had a limited angle, but it showed enough. Hours of empty hallway. Lights flicking on and off automatically. No shadows lingering too long. No one stopping at the cabinet. The footage was boring in the most reassuring way possible. Still, I wasn't satisfied. I inspected the cabinet itself. The lock was intact, no scratches, no signs of tampering. The drawer slid smoothly, resisting nothing. I even checked the hinges, feeling ridiculous as I did it, like a man trying to catch his own reflection moving when he wasn't looking. Nothing. Later that morning, I crossed paths with Helen Brooks near the intake desk. She was sorting forms, glasses perched low on her nose, humming faintly to herself. "Did you reprocess the unclaimed file from last week?" I asked, keeping my tone casual. She didn't even look up. "No. Why would I? It's already logged." "You didn't adjust the photo? Replace it?" Helen finally glanced at me, eyebrows lifting slightly. "We don't replace ID photos, Ethan. Once it's clipped, it stays. You know that." "I know," I said quickly. "Just checking." She studied my face for a second longer than necessary, then went back to her paperwork. "You should get some rest. You look like you've been pulling double shifts." That explanation followed me for the rest of the day. Fatigue. Stress. A mind filling in blanks that didn't exist. It was comforting because it made the problem mine, and therefore controllable. Frank, however, didn't offer comfort when I mentioned the file. "You're overthinking it," he said flatly, standing beside the furnace controls. "Unclaimed cases mess with people if they let them. That's why we don't linger." "I just want to make sure the records are solid," I replied. "They are," he said. "And don't go digging for problems that aren't there. This place already has enough weight." That word stuck with me. Wait. Because that was exactly how it felt. The longer the file sat in that drawer, the heavier it seemed. Not physically, but in the way you're aware of something behind you even when you don't turn around. That night, against my better judgment, I opened the drawer again. The folder lay where I had left it, unchanged, unremarkable. I hesitated, then pulled it free and laid it flat on the desk. The overhead light hummed softly, casting an even glow across the page. I forced myself to approach the photograph the way I'd been trained. No interpretation. No emotion. Just observation. Male. Estimated early 60s. Gray hair. Neutral mouth. But neutrality was no longer what I saw. The man's expression hadn't grown dramatic. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't glaring. Instead, his face carried something subtler, and far more unsettling. Awareness. As if the photograph no longer existed to record him, but to acknowledge that he was there. It felt wrong to keep looking. I glanced at the timestamp printed beneath the image, confirming it was the same photograph taken days earlier. Same resolution. Same grain. No signs of editing. No variation in contrast or exposure. And yet, it was undeniably different from what I remembered. I closed the folder slowly and rested my hands on top of it, grounding myself in the feel of the paper beneath my palms. My heart was beating harder now, loud enough that I was aware of it in the quiet room. "No one touched you," I murmured, not realizing I'd spoken aloud until the words echoed faintly back at me. The sentence didn't calm me. It terrified me. Because if no one had touched the file, if no one had altered the photograph, then the change hadn't come from the outside. It had come from within. I returned the folder to the drawer and locked it, sliding the key into my pocket instead of its usual place. It was a small act, almost meaningless, but it made me feel less exposed. As I shut off the lights and prepared to leave, a thought settled into my mind with disturbing clarity. Rules existed here for a reason. And the strictest rule of all wasn't about paperwork or procedure. It was about never revisiting what was supposed to be finished. Whatever was happening inside that unclaimed file hadn't broken the rules. It had simply been waiting for me to notice. I didn't sleep after that shift. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the photograph exactly as it had looked on the desk. Flat, grainy, silent, and yet impossibly attentive. It wasn't fear that kept me awake at first. It was the effort of replaying memory, trying to pin it down like evidence. I needed to know whether the image had truly changed, or whether my mind had finally slipped in a way I could no longer control. By morning, exhaustion had stripped away my patience for excuses. When I returned for my next shift, the building greeted me the same way it always did. The lights flickered on in stages. The ventilation system exhaled warm air into the corridors. Nothing felt wrong. That almost made it worse. If something had been off, if an alarm had sounded or a door had been left open, I could have blamed the unease on that. Instead, everything worked. I waited until late evening when the administrative office was empty and the sounds of the building softened into their nighttime rhythm. I unlocked the cabinet with the key still warm from my pocket and slid open the unclaimed drawer. I told myself this would be the last time. One final check, done carefully, done honestly. The folder came out smoothly. The metal tag clinked softly against the desk as I laid it down. My hands didn't shake. That surprised me. I felt steady, focused, almost clinical. Something had changed, I would see it. And if it hadn't, I would close the file and accept that the problem was me. I lifted the top page and uncovered the photograph. The difference was immediate. There was no need to search for it this time. No need to compare angles or lighting or memory. The man in the photo no longer looked neutral. His eyes were sharper now, the lids drawn tighter, as though he were concentrating on something just beyond the camera. The faint crease between his brows had deepened, not into anger but into intent. Most unsettling of all was his mouth. The corners hadn't lifted into a smile, not quite. But they no longer rested flat. There was tension there, the subtle suggestion of restraint, like someone holding back a reaction they didn't want to reveal. I felt my breath catch before I could stop it. "This isn't possible," I said quietly. The photograph did not respond. It didn't need to. The change spoke for itself. I leaned back in my chair, creating distance between myself and the desk. The room felt smaller than it had a moment ago, the walls closer, the ceiling lower. I became acutely aware of the silence, of how nothing moved unless I moved it. I forced myself to check the details again. Timestamp. File number. Paper quality. Everything was identical. The image bore no signs of tampering, no evidence of being swapped or reprinted. It was the same photograph, just not the same face. A cold realization settled in, slow and heavy. This wasn't about perception anymore. Fatigue couldn't explain consistency. Memory couldn't account for progression. The expression hadn't simply shifted once. It had continued to change. Something about that thought made my stomach turn. I thought of Frank's rule. Don't revisit closed files. Don't personalize the work. Don't linger. Those rules weren't about superstition or sentimentality. They were about containment. About leaving things where they belonged. And I had violated that boundary more than once. I reached out, then stopped myself inches from the page. The urge to touch the photograph, to confirm it was real, solid, was overwhelming. But another instinct rose up just as strong, warning me not to cross that final line. I pulled my hand back. "You're unclaimed," I whispered, the words sounding strange in the quiet room. "There's no one left to see you." The man's eyes seemed fixed now, no longer unfocused, no longer distant. They held their position with an intensity that made my skin prickle, as if the photograph had finally found what it had been waiting for. Recognition. I closed the folder slowly, deliberately, and stood up. My legs felt unsteady, not weak, but disconnected, like my body was a step behind my thoughts. As I returned the file to the drawer, one certainty pressed itself into my mind with undeniable force. This was no longer a passive record. Whatever remained of that man wasn't in the furnace. It wasn't in the body. It wasn't even in the building itself. It was in the only place left where he still existed. And now that it had been seen, truly seen, it wasn't finished changing. After that night, I stopped pretending this was about a photograph. It was an easy lie at first, to tell myself the image was the problem, that paper and ink had somehow become the focus of my unease. But lies don't hold up when you live inside them. By the next few shifts, I understood the truth well enough to avoid saying it out loud. The photograph wasn't changing on its own. It was responding. I moved through my work more slowly now. Not because I was afraid of the equipment or the building, but because my attention kept drifting back to the same thought. What remains when everything else is gone? We reduce a life to ash, seal the paperwork, archive the proof that it ever passed through our hands. We call that closure. We call that finished. But unclaimed cases didn't have closure. They had abandonment. I began noticing how often I treated those files as weightless. Thin folders. No stories attached. No one to ask questions. They moved through the system like static, present just long enough to be processed and erased. I'd always told myself that was mercy. That forgetting was kinder than lingering. Now I wasn't so sure. Every time I passed the administrative office, I felt the drawer before I saw it. A pressure behind my eyes. A subtle pull, like standing near deep water and sensing the current even when the surface looks calm. I didn't open it again, not right away, but I knew the file was there, unchanged in location and yet no longer static. It occurred to me then that we'd been wrong about the purpose of those photographs. They weren't just identifiers. They were witnesses. In cases where families came forward, the photo was a formality. A brief step in a longer ritual of remembrance. But for the unclaimed, the photograph was the last place where someone acknowledged their face without expectation. The last moment where they were looked at, not as a body, not as a case number, but as a person who existed. And I had looked. That realization followed me into the furnace room later that night. I stood in front of the reinforced glass, watching the low orange glow settle into its steady rhythm. The machine did what it always did. It consumed. It reduced. It ended things efficiently, without malice or hesitation. I wondered if that was why the file unsettled me so deeply. Because the furnace finished what the world had already abandoned. The man in the photograph hadn't been angry. That was what struck me most. There was no accusation in his eyes, no plea. What I'd mistaken for intent now felt closer to awareness, an understanding that something unfinished had finally been noticed, not remembered. I thought about the hundreds of unclaimed files I'd processed over the years. How many faces had passed through my hands without leaving an impression? How many had disappeared without resistance? The system rewarded that. Efficiency depended on it. But this one hadn't disappeared quietly. Late in my shift, I found myself standing outside the office door, key in hand, debating with a seriousness that bordered on dread. I told myself I wasn't going to open the drawer. That I didn't need to confirm anything else. I already knew enough. The key stayed in my pocket. Instead, I leaned my forehead briefly against the cool metal of the door and closed my eyes. For a moment, just one, I imagined what it must be like to exist only as an image, to be reduced to a single frozen expression while everything else faded. No voice. No context. Just a face waiting for acknowledgement. When I opened my eyes, the thought lingered longer than it should have. I understood then that the change hadn't started with the photograph. It had started with me. With my attention. With my refusal to let the file remain invisible. Whatever remained of that man wasn't seeking escape or revenge. It wasn't haunting the building or reaching for the living. It was doing something far quieter. It was holding on to the only proof that it had not passed through this world entirely unseen. I walked away from the office without opening the door. The lights dimmed behind me, returning the hallway to its usual stillness. But the weight didn't lift. Because some endings don't want to be interrupted. And some presences don't need bodies or names or sound. They only need one person to look closely enough to realize that what was supposed to be gone had never truly left. The cremation was scheduled for the following evening. Seeing the date typed into the system made everything feel heavier, more final than it had before. A process I'd treated as routine for years suddenly carried a sense of consequence I couldn't quite define. This wasn't about delay or paperwork anymore. The waiting period had passed. No one had come forward. By every rule we followed, the man in the unclaimed file was ready to be finished. That knowledge settled uneasily in my chest. I told myself the unease was misplaced. The work hadn't changed. The rules hadn't changed. Only my attention had. And attention, I reminded myself, has a way of turning ordinary things into burdens if you let it. Still, I avoided the office for most of the night. I kept busy in the furnace room, double-checking controls that didn't need checking, logging temperatures that stayed within perfect range. The machines ran smoothly, obediently. There was comfort in their indifference. Fire didn't hesitate. It didn't question. It didn't look back. The administrative wing felt different. Every time I passed the hallway that led to it, my pace slowed. The door stood closed, unremarkable, its surface reflecting the dim light like it always had. I imagined the drawer inside, the thin folder resting among others like it, and wondered if the photograph had changed again, or if it no longer needed to. I didn't open it. That night, sleep came in fragments. I dreamed I was standing in the office, the overhead light buzzing softly above me. The cabinet was open, the unclaimed drawer pulled all the way out. Inside, the folders were upright, pressed together tightly, their labels facing forward. All of them had photographs. Not just the one. Every face was turned toward me, expressions identical in their stillness. Not fear. Not anger. Just attention. As if the room itself had become aware of being observed. In the center drawer, the unclaimed man's photograph was different. His expression had softened. The tension around his mouth was gone, replaced by something almost calm. His eyes no longer fixed on me but past me as though he'd already seen what he needed to see. I woke before the dream could finish, my heart beating harder than the silence around me justified. The rest of the night passed without incident. No alarms. No strange sounds. No flickering lights. That disturbed me more than anything else. It felt deliberate, as though the building itself had agreed to wait. By the time my next shift began, I'd made a decision. I would not check the file again before the cremation. It wasn't denial. It was restraint. Some things I'd learned didn't require confirmation to be real. And I had the sense that opening the drawer one more time would cross a line I couldn't uncross. The paperwork was finalized early in the evening. I signed off on the schedule, initialed the forms, and locked them away without looking at the photograph. My hand lingered on the folder only long enough to feel its thinness, its fragility. "You okay?" Frank asked later, noticing my silence as we prepared the furnace. Yeah, I said, and the answer wasn't entirely a lie. He nodded, satisfied, and moved on. Frank trusted systems more than people. He trusted them to contain things. I wasn't so sure anymore. As the hour grew closer, I found myself standing alone in the hallway, listening to the quiet hum of the building. The sense of being watched had faded, replaced by something else. Anticipation, perhaps. Or acceptance. The man in the unclaimed file had been unseen for a long time. Tomorrow he would be reduced to ash like all the others. And for reasons I couldn't fully explain, I felt certain that whatever remained of him was already preparing for that moment, not with resistance, but with the calm of something that finally understood what was about to be taken away. And what would remain? The furnace was already warm when I arrived. That wasn't unusual. We preheated the chamber hours in advance to ensure a stable burn, to avoid fluctuations that could compromise the process. I'd done it hundreds of times, enough that my hands moved without conscious thought. Switches, gauges, readouts. Everything fell into place with practiced ease. Tonight the routine felt heavier. The unclaimed body had been transferred from cold storage earlier in the evening. The gurney stood beside the chamber, draped and still. There were no flowers. No family waiting beyond a door. No words spoken aloud. In cases like this, silence was standard. I checked the metal ID tag one final time and matched it to the log. The number was correct. It always was. Procedure didn't allow room for mistakes. As we moved the body into position, I focused on the mechanics of the task. The alignment, the clearance, the way the door sealed with a dull, final sound. I did not look for meaning. I did not allow myself to wonder who this man had been. Fire didn't care. And neither could I. When the cycle began, the chamber filled with its familiar glow. The reinforced glass darkened slightly, filtering the light into something softer, less direct. I stood there longer than necessary, watching the flames settle into their steady rhythm. Nothing unusual happened. No sounds. No movement behind the glass. No sudden surges in temperature. The furnace did exactly what it was designed to do. That should have been the end of it. I logged the start time, closed the chamber room, and returned to the administrative office to complete the remaining paperwork. My steps felt slow, measured, as if the building itself had decided to move at a different pace. The office light flickered on, bathing the desk in its familiar dull glow. Everything looked the same as it always had. The cabinet, the chair, the drawer. For a moment I stood there, unsure why my chest felt so tight. Then I understood. The file. I hadn't planned to open it. I told myself I wouldn't. But plans have a way of dissolving when you realize something important has already happened without you. I unlocked the drawer and pulled the folder free. The photograph lay where it always had, clipped neatly to the page. I looked at it. And for the first time since this began, the change felt complete. The man's expression was different. Not sharper, not more intent, but softer. The tension I'd noticed before was gone. His eyes no longer seemed to search the space beyond the camera. Instead, they rested, unfocused, as though whatever awareness had been building had finally reached its conclusion. There was no sense of being watched. Only a quiet absence. I felt something loosen in my chest, a release I hadn't realized I'd been holding on to. The photograph no longer demanded attention. It didn't pull at my awareness or press against my thoughts. It simply existed, flat and still, like paper and ink were always meant to. I checked the timestamp again, my hands steady. Same image. Same file. Nothing external had changed. Yet everything had. I closed the folder and returned it to the drawer, this time without hesitation. The cabinet slid shut and I locked it with a deliberate turn of the key. When I left the office, the hallway felt wider than before. The hum of the building returned to its usual rhythm. The sense of weight that had followed me for days finally lifted, leaving behind a quiet I recognized. Later, when I checked the chamber again, the cycle continued without incident. The process moved forward as it always had, efficient and complete. Whatever had been held in that photograph no longer needed to remain. As I logged the end of the shift and prepared to leave, one thought lingered, gentle, persistent, and deeply unsettling. Some things don't resist being finished. They only wait to be acknowledged before they can finally let go. The next morning arrived without ceremony. Sunlight filtered through the narrow windows along the east side of the building, pale and indifferent. The cremation cycle had completed overnight, right on schedule. The furnace cooled the way it always did, metal contracting with soft, familiar clicks. When I checked the chamber, there was nothing unexpected waiting for me, only ash, fine and uniform, gathered where it was meant to be. Procedure resumed its place at the center of everything. I processed the remains carefully, transferring them into the temporary container, labeling it with the same number that had followed the man since intake. No name. No destination. In cases like this, the county would decide what happened next. My role ended here. That finality should have felt reassuring. Instead, I felt hollow. Not empty, just quieter inside, as though something that had been pressing against my thoughts had stepped away, leaving behind an unfamiliar stillness. I moved through the rest of my shift on autopilot, completing tasks I could have done blindfolded. My hands remembered the motions even when my mind wandered. I avoided the administrative office for most of the day. When I finally went in to close out the file, I paused in the doorway longer than necessary. The room looked unchanged. Same desk. Same chair. Same filing cabinet, its surface dull with age. Whatever had happened over the past week had left no visible mark on the space itself. I opened the drawer. The folder was exactly where it belonged. I took it out and laid it on the desk, feeling none of the resistance I'd felt before. No tightening in my chest. No pull behind my eyes. Just paper. The photograph was the last thing I looked at. The man's face had returned to something close to neutrality. Not the blankness I remembered from the beginning, but a softer version of it, unburdened, unexpectant. His eyes no longer searched. His mouth no longer held tension. If anything, he looked distant now, like someone already moving away from a conversation that had ended. It struck me then that I couldn't clearly remember what he had looked like the first time. The memory had blurred, overwritten by every version that came after. Maybe that was fitting. Maybe that was how it was supposed to be. Identity dissolving, not all at once, but in stages, each layer giving way when it was no longer needed. I closed the folder for the last time and stamped it closed. The sound of the stamp echoed louder than it should have in the small room. Frank signed off on the paperwork later that afternoon without comment. Helen filed the final notice with the county. The system absorbed the case the way it always did, quietly and without acknowledgement. By the end of the day, the unclaimed man existed only as a line item in a ledger. And yet, as I walked the halls that evening, the building felt subtly altered. Not haunted. Not charged. Just settled. The air moved more freely. The quiet no longer pressed back when I listened to it. I realized then that the unease I'd felt hadn't been a warning. It had been a responsibility. To notice. To witness. To allow something unfinished to be seen before it disappeared completely. I'd done that. Whatever had lingered in the photograph hadn't followed me out of the office. It hadn't clung to the furnace or embedded itself in the walls. It had ended where it was meant to, without spectacle, without disruption. That knowledge didn't bring comfort. But it brought clarity. As I locked up and stepped outside into the cooling evening air, I understood something I hadn't before. We think the dead need rituals, names, ceremonies, and maybe some do. But others need only one thing. To not vanish without leaving a trace in someone else's mind. I got into my car and drove home, the image of that face already fading at the edges of my memory. By the time I reached the end of the street, I couldn't have described his features with any certainty. And for the first time since this began, that felt like exactly the way it should be. Time didn't stop after that case. It never does. Weeks passed, then months, each shift blending into the next the way they always had. New files arrived. New names. New faces clipped to thin folders that would eventually be closed and shelved. The work resumed its familiar rhythm, steady and reliable, and on the surface, everything returned to normal. But something in me had shifted. I noticed it the first time I opened another unclaimed file. My hand hesitated, not from fear but from awareness. I found myself looking at the photograph longer than necessary, not searching for change, but acknowledging the stillness of the face staring back at me. I didn't imagine movement. I didn't expect recognition. I simply looked, and then I moved on. Frank never asked about that case again. Helen didn't mention it. The system absorbed it the way it absorbed everything else, leaving no trace that it had ever been different. That was the point of systems like ours. They exist to ensure continuity, not memory. Still, certain nights felt quieter than before. Not emptier, just resolved. The building no longer carried that subtle pressure I'd grown used to, the sense of something unfinished lingering just beyond reach. The hum of the ventilation felt cleaner. The hallways felt longer, less compressed by unspoken weight. I stopped dreaming about the cabinet. In time, even the details of the unclaimed man faded. I couldn't have told you the color of his eyes or the shape of his mouth if you'd asked. The photograph had loosened its hold on my memory, dissolving the way ash does when it's scattered, present for a moment, then gone. And yet, the lesson remained. I came to understand that this place wasn't haunted by the dead. It was shaped by attention. By what we chose to see and what we chose to pass by. Most people assume the end of a life happens at a single moment, sharp and final. Working here taught me otherwise. Endings are layered. They happen in stages, when the body stops, when the fire finishes, when the paperwork closes. And sometimes when the last person who noticed finally lets go. One night, near the end of a long shift, I stood alone in the administrative office, holding a newly arrived unclaimed file. The photograph showed a woman this time. Late 50s maybe. Neutral expression. Eyes fixed just past the lens. I studied it briefly, then clipped the file shut. "You were here," I said quietly, the words barely more than breath. That was all. I logged the file, slid it into the drawer, and locked the cabinet. No weight followed me out of the room. No sense of anticipation. Just the familiar quiet of a job done properly. As I walked down the hallway, the lights dimmed behind me in steady sequence, returning the building to its resting state. The furnace room was silent. The chambers dark. Everything waited for the next shift, the next name, the next ending. I realized then that what I'd experienced hadn't been a warning or a haunting. It had been a reminder. We think remembrance requires permanence, that being remembered means being held onto. But sometimes remembrance is brief by design. A moment of acknowledgement before release. A single witness standing between existence and disappearance. That's enough. I still work here. I still follow the rules. I still don't linger on closed files. But I no longer treat them as empty. Each one carries the weight of a life that passed through unseen, and for a moment, just one, it passes through me as well. Then it's gone. And the building breathes on, unchanged, holding only the quiet certainty that nothing truly ends the instant we think it does. Some things don't need to stay. They only need to be seen, once, before they can finally rest.